He had survived blizzards that buried cattle alive. He had rebuilt fences with bleeding hands in -20 wind. He had buried his father alone in frozen ground without shedding a single tear. Wyatt Mercer was afraid of nothing, except her. The woman who lived across the creek, the one who had been right there for years while he looked everywhere else for meaning. This is the story of a man who had everything, and almost threw away the only thing that mattered. Stay until the end. You won't regret it. And if this story moves you, hit that subscribe button, join our family, and drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The summer Wyatt Mercer turned 31, a fence post snapped in half and changed the entire direction of his life. He didn't know that yet, of course. He was too busy swearing at the post. It was the third one that week. Spring floods had loosened the ground along the south edge of his property, and the fencing that separated his land from the creek had begun leaning like old men at a bar, slowly, steadily, inevitably toward collapse. Wyatt had ridden out that morning with a shovel, 2 replacement posts, and a coffee that had gone cold somewhere between the barn and the creek bank. He was working alone, which was not unusual. Wyatt Mercer almost always worked alone. He drove the first post with the kind of efficiency that came from doing something 1,000 times. No wasted motion, no hesitation. The mallet came down hard and even, and the wood bit into the earth exactly where he wanted it. The second post cracked on the third swing. Son of a... He pulled it out, examined the split running up the grain, and tossed it aside. Cheap lumber. He'd have to ride back to town tomorrow and argue with the man at the supply store who would claim the wood was fine and imply that Wyatt's technique was the problem. They had this argument roughly twice a year. Neither of them enjoyed it. Neither of them stopped having it. He was reaching for the last post when he heard her laugh. It wasn't a loud laugh. It wasn't the kind of laugh designed to be heard. It was the sort of sound that happens when something genuinely catches a person off guard. Bright and unplanned, gone almost before it arrived. But the creek was shallow, and the afternoon was quiet, and it carried. Wyatt straightened. Across the water, on the Whitaker side of the bank, Evelyn Whitaker was kneeling beside a flat rock, scrubbing a shirt against the stone with the focused energy of someone working through something in her head. Her younger sister had apparently said something that struck her as funny because she sat back on her heels and laughed again, this time longer, and then shook her head and went back to the washing like the laugh had never happened. Wyatt stood there with a fence post in his hand and stared. He had known Evelyn Whitaker his entire adult life. The Whitakers had farmed the land east of the creek for longer than Wyatt had owned his ranch. He had eaten at their table more than once. He had helped her father, Gerald, pull a wagon out of a ditch 3 winters ago. He had watched Evelyn grow from a quiet teenager into a grown woman who ran half the household while her mother battled the kind of fatigue that never fully lifted. She was his neighbor. She was Gerald Whitaker's daughter. She was Evelyn. He had never once looked at her the way he was looking at her right now. She was wearing a plain work dress, dark at the hem from the creek water. Her hair was pinned up but coming loose in the heat, and she kept pushing a strand back from her face with her wrist because her hands were wet. There was a smear of something, soap maybe or mud, along her left forearm. She looked completely, entirely ordinary. And Wyatt couldn't make himself look away. She glanced up. He felt like a man caught doing something wrong, which was ridiculous, because he was standing on his own property fixing his own fence. He gave her the same brief nod he'd given her 100 times before. Evelyn gave him the same brief nod back. Then she went back to her washing and he went back to his post, and nothing happened, and the afternoon moved on like it always did. But something had shifted, something Wyatt couldn't name and didn't particularly want to examine. Well, he'd come to Red Hollow at 22, which was young to be buying land, but old enough to know that waiting around for someone to hand you something was a losing strategy. His father had taught him that much, even if the old man hadn't meant to. Carl Mercer had spent 30 years waiting for his luck to turn, and died still waiting. Wyatt had watched that and decided early, you don't wait, you work. He had bought the Mercer ranch from a widow named Clara Holt, who was moving to Denver to live with her daughter and seemed genuinely relieved to hand the problem of the place over to someone else. The roof leaked in two spots. The eastern pasture had been overgrazed and needed a full year to recover. The well had a crack in the casing that nobody had bothered to fix. Wyatt fixed all of it, slowly, over years. With money he didn't always have and time he could barely spare. He built a cattle operation modest enough to be honest and large enough to survive a bad season, which was the only kind of ambition that made practical sense in northern Colorado. He hired two hands in the busy months, Cord, who was competent and quiet, and a rotating series of younger men who lasted anywhere from 1 summer to 3 years depending on how much they'd romanticized ranch work before arriving. He was not unhappy. That mattered to him. He had learned to be careful with happiness. His mother had been a woman who wanted too much, not in a selfish way, but in the way of someone who believed the world owed her something beautiful. And he had watched that wanting slowly hollow her out over the years. She passed when Wyatt was 19, and he'd sometimes thought that she had not died of illness exactly, but of disappointment. He was not going to make that mistake, so he kept his life manageable. He kept his expectations reasonable. He worked. He maintained. He endured the winters and survived the slow seasons and paid his debts and stayed on the right side of his word. And when men in town asked if he planned to find himself a wife and settle down proper, he'd smile in a way that ended the conversation without being rude about it. He was fine. He had enough. That was what he told himself. The Whitakers were good neighbors in the truest sense, the kind who didn't involve themselves in your business unless you were drowning, at which point they showed up without being asked. Gerald Whitaker was a lean, serious man who treated farming the way Wyatt treated ranching, as a calling that demanded everything you had and occasionally took more. He didn't complain about this. He didn't praise it either. He simply did the work, the same as his father had, the same as he expected his children to. Margaret Whitaker, Gerald's wife, had the kind of warmth that radiated without effort. She'd gotten sick 3 years ago. Nothing anyone put a clean name to, just a slow general dimming of energy that the doctor in Red Hollow attributed to various causes at various times. And since then, the running of the household had shifted, quietly and without drama, to Evelyn. Evelyn had stepped into the role without fanfare. That was what struck Wyatt most, looking back, when he tried to identify the exact moment he'd started noticing her as something other than background. There had been no performance of sacrifice, no sighing, no making sure everyone understood the weight she was carrying. She just carried it. He had learned this partly from observation and partly from Cord, whose sister lived on the Whitaker property's western boundary and passed along the kind of community intelligence that traveled through women's networks faster and more accurately than anything published in a newspaper. Evelyn Whitaker delivered meals to half the valley last January, Cord mentioned one morning, not looking up from the harness he was mending. Henderson broke his leg. Old Mrs. Payne had her bad spell, that Dawson widow with the 3 kids. That's so, Wyatt said. Did it without telling anyone she was doing it. Henderson's wife mentioned it to my sister, or nobody would have known. Wyatt didn't respond. He was busy, but he noticed. The Red Hollow summer gathering happened every year in the wide clearing behind the church, and attendance was less a choice than a social obligation enforced by decades of community expectation. Wyatt went because not going would have required more energy than going. He ate the food, spoke to the people he needed to speak to, and counted the reasonable time he had to stay before leaving without insulting anyone. It was a calculation he'd refined over the years. This year, something disrupted the calculation. He was standing near the fence on the far side of the clearing, talking land prices with an older rancher named Emmett, when he became aware, in the peripheral physical way you notice something without deciding to notice it, that there was a cluster of people on the far end near the dance space. He glanced over. Evelyn was standing there, and 3 men were standing near her, and they were not standing near her by accident. One of them, a younger man, maybe 24, good-looking in the uncomplicated way of someone who hadn't been tested yet, leaned toward her and said something. She smiled politely. Politely. Wyatt had seen that smile before. It was the smile you gave when you were being nice without being interested. The young man didn't seem to notice the difference. A second man asked her to dance. Evelyn glanced toward her mother, who was seated nearby, and said something that appeared to decline without causing offense, and the man nodded and drifted back. Wyatt realized he had completely stopped listening to Emmett. "Think it's the water table," Emmett was saying, "or the grazing rotation. Hard to know. Yeah, Wyatt said. Hard to know. He took a drink of something he wasn't tasting and kept his eyes on the middle distance. The feeling sitting in his chest was not comfortable. It was something he recognized from years ago, from a time before he'd made peace with wanting less. A clenching, dissatisfied, almost angry feeling. The feeling of seeing something and knowing, with complete certainty, that you were not going to do anything about it. He didn't like it. He didn't understand it. He ignored it. Thomas Bell found him later near the drink table when the evening was slowing and people were beginning to drift toward their wagons. Thomas was 70 if he was a day, with a face carved by about 40 years of high-altitude weather and a manner that had stopped bothering with social cushioning sometime around 1880. He ranched a spread north of Wyatt's, had buried 2 wives and outlasted 3 business partners, and had developed the particular directness of a man who had decided that time was no longer something he could afford to waste. "You're an idiot," Thomas said pleasantly, stopping beside Wyatt. Wyatt looked at him. "Evening, Thomas. You've been standing over here watching Evelyn Whittaker be polite to men who aren't worth half of what you are, and you're doing absolutely nothing about it." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "I don't know what you think you're seeing." "I'm seeing what I'm seeing. I've got bad knees and I'm old, but my eyes work fine." Thomas picked up a cup and examined its contents with mild skepticism. "Your father was the same way, you know. Spent so much time protecting what he had that he couldn't open his hands to hold something new." "I knew my father," Wyatt said. His voice came out flatter than he intended. "Then you know I'm right." Thomas set the cup down. "You've spent 9 years building a ranch. You've got good land and a solid operation, and you're respected in this county, and you're going to watch someone else marry that girl because you've got yourself convinced that wanting something is the same as losing something." Wyatt didn't answer. Thomas shrugged one shoulder. "Your choice. Was just an observation." He walked away toward a group of men near the wagons, apparently finished with the conversation. Wyatt stood there. The gathering noise moved around him, laughter, fiddle music drifting from the far side. Children being corralled by exhausted parents. Normal evening, normal summer. He thought about Evelyn's polite smile aimed at a man she didn't want. He thought about Thomas's words, which were irritating in the specific way that accurate things often were. He drove home alone in the dark, and the sound of the wheels on the dry road was the only company he had, and for the first time in years, that bothered him. Plus, he didn't sleep well. He lay in the ranch house he'd repaired and expanded and maintained for 9 years, in a room he'd furnished practically and without any particular thought for what it might look like to another person, and he stared at the ceiling while the summer night pressed against the windows. Wanting something meant having something to lose. He knew exactly where that idea had come from. He could trace it back to his father, who had wanted a better farm and got debt. He could trace it back to his mother, who had wanted more life and got disappointment. He could trace it back to his own first years in Red Hollow, when he'd been 22 and stupid and hopeful in the ways that young men are before reality takes the edge off. He had decided, somewhere along the way, that being careful was the same as being smart. He had decided that needing less meant hurting less, and lying in the dark at 31, he understood, not with any particular comfort, that he had been wrong. The not wanting hadn't protected him from anything. It had just made his life smaller. He didn't fix anything that night. He didn't come to any grand conclusion. He just lay there with the discomfort of a man who has looked at something honest for the first time in a long while. Outside, the creek moved over its stones in the dark, the same as it always had. And on the other side of it, Evelyn Whittaker slept in her family's house, unaware that anything had changed. Nothing had changed, except everything had. The morning after the gathering, Wyatt was up before the sun. Not because he'd slept and woken naturally, but because he'd given up on sleep somewhere around 3 in the morning and decided that being useful was better than lying in the dark arguing with himself. He fed the horses. He checked the water troughs. He walked the south pasture in the gray pre-dawn light and counted the cattle by habit, the numbers coming automatically while his mind did something else entirely. Thomas Bell's words had followed him home and apparently decided to stay. You've got yourself convinced that wanting something is the same as losing something. He didn't like Thomas Bell very much this morning. Cord arrived at first light, noticed Wyatt's expression, and had the good sense not to say anything. They worked the morning in their usual near silence, moving cattle to the north pasture, patching a section of fence that the spring floods had left at a dangerous lean, checking on a heifer that had been off her feed for 2 days. The heifer seemed better, small mercies. Around mid-morning, Cord broke the quiet. "You going to the Whitakers later?" Wyatt looked at him. "Why would I be going to the Whitakers?" "Henderson's still laid up with his leg. Gerald's been short-handed all week. I heard Margaret's doing poorly again." Cord said this like it was simply information, which it might have been. With Cord, it was often difficult to distinguish between observation and pointed suggestion. "Figured you might offer a hand. I've got enough to do here." "We're ahead," Cord said. "The heifer's better. Fence is fixed. You could spare a few hours." Wyatt picked up his tools and started toward the barn. "I'll think about it." He thought about it for exactly 40 minutes before saddling up and riding east toward the creek. He told himself it was because Gerald was a good neighbor, and good neighbors helped each other when they were short-handed. This was true. It was also true that this logic had existed every day for the past 3 years, and he had not once acted on it with this particular urgency. He told himself that too, somewhere in the back of his mind, and ignored it. Gerald Whitaker was in his east field when Wyatt rode up, wrestling with a section of irrigation ditch that had partially collapsed. He was a strong man, Gerald, but he was past 50 and working problems that needed 2 pairs of hands, and the frustration on his face when Wyatt appeared shifted quickly into something more honest. "Could use the help," Gerald said, which from him was essentially a declaration of desperation. "That's why I'm here," Wyatt said, and tied off his horse. They worked together for 3 hours, clearing the collapsed section, relining it with flat stones from the creek bed, and reinforcing the edges with timber Gerald had stacked nearby and never gotten around to using. The work was physical and direct, and it didn't require much conversation, which suited both of them. Gerald Whitaker was not a man who talked while he worked, but at one point, loading stones, Gerald said without preamble, "Evelyn mentioned you came to the gathering last night." Wyatt kept loading stones. "Half the county was there." "She noticed you." Gerald said it the same way he said everything, flat and factual. Wyatt didn't answer that. Gerald didn't push it. He picked up a stone and set it into place, and that was the end of it. Except that it wasn't, because Wyatt spent the rest of the afternoon turning those 3 words over like a stone in his own hand. "She noticed you." Not she said hello or she saw you there. Gerald Whitaker, a man who chose words the way other men chose tools, had said she noticed you, and that was a specific and deliberate thing to say. He was putting his tools back when Evelyn appeared from the direction of the house, carrying a tin pail and walking with the quick, purposeful stride of someone managing a list in their head. She pulled up when she saw him. "Wyatt." Not surprised exactly, but recalibrating. "I didn't know you were here." "Your father needed a hand with the ditch." She glanced at the repaired section, then back at him. "You fixed the whole eastern run." "It needed doing." A beat of silence. Not uncomfortable exactly. More like the conversational equivalent of 2 people both reaching for the same door handle at the same time, and then both stopping. "Are you staying for supper?" she asked. The question was practical. It was the kind of thing you asked someone who had spent their afternoon on your family's irrigation problem. It wasn't anything more than that. "I shouldn't," Wyatt said. Evelyn nodded. She adjusted the handle of the pail in her hand. "Well, thank you for the help." It was nothing. She tilted her head slightly. Not agreement, not disagreement, something in between. "It wasn't nothing." She said it matter-of-factly, and then she walked on toward the barn, and Wyatt stood there watching her go and feeling like a man who had just been handed an opportunity and put it carefully down on the ground and walked away from it. He rode home in the golden, late-afternoon light and gave himself a thorough, honest accounting of exactly what he was doing, and the accounting was not flattering. He was a coward. Specifically, he was the worst kind of coward, the kind who dressed their fear up as practicality. He didn't fix that either. He put the horse up and went inside and made himself a meal and ate it alone, same as he always did. And the house was quiet in the specific way it was always quiet. And tonight that quiet had a different quality to it. Not peaceful, just empty. The distinction he was discovering mattered more than he'd previously thought. Over the weeks that followed, Wyatt found reasons to be near the Whitaker property that would not have convinced anyone paying close attention, least of all himself. Gerald needed help mending his barn roof. That was genuine. A section of the shared creek bank needed reinforcing on both sides. That was real. A lame horse of Gerald's that Wyatt happened to know something about treating. That was legitimate. What was not entirely legitimate was the way Wyatt timed these visits, or the way he noticed when Evelyn was working in the kitchen garden and found himself taking the longer route to the barn so that the path went past it. He was careful. He was always careful. He gave himself plausible explanations for everything. But the truth was accumulating the way debt accumulates, quietly, until one day you look up and the number is bigger than you'd believed possible. He began walking with her on the days she made her rounds to the older neighbors, Mrs. Payne, who was widowed and arthritic and pretended not to need the food Evelyn brought. The Henderson family, where the father was still recovering and his wife was stretched thin between nursing him and managing 3 children. A scattered handful of others who made up the invisible network of people Evelyn had apparently decided were her responsibility. Wyatt told himself he was going because the roads weren't always safe, and a woman traveling alone was a practical concern. Evelyn told him, the first time when he appeared beside her on the road out of Red Hollow, that she had been making these rounds alone for 2 years and hadn't had a problem. "I know," he said. "Then why are you here?" He thought about that. "Company," he finally said. She looked at him sideways, evaluating. Then she seemed to decide the answer was acceptable, or at least honest enough, and she nodded and kept walking, and he fell into step beside her. They talked on those walks in a way Wyatt hadn't talked to anyone in years. Not about feelings or intentions, nothing like that, nothing he couldn't have said in the middle of a town meeting, but about real things, practical things that turned out to matter. She told him her theory about the creek's behavior in dry summers, the way the water table shifted, how it predicted what the autumn grazing would look like. She was right, based on what he knew of his own land, and he said so, and she didn't perform modesty about it the way some people did when they were told they were right. She just said, "I've been watching it for 8 years, as though that were explanation enough, which it was. He told her about his plans to expand the herd cautiously over the next 2 years. Not dramatically, just enough to put the operation on more stable footing. She asked questions he hadn't expected her to ask, about feed costs and water access, and how he planned to manage the summer pasture rotation if he increased the numbers. Good questions, the kind a rancher would ask. "You know cattle," he said, surprised despite himself. "I know land," she said. "Cattle are just part of the land." He thought about that for a while as they walked, and then he said, "Your father doesn't give you enough credit." She laughed at that. A short, real laugh, not her polite one. "My father gives me exactly as much credit as a man of his generation knows how to give his daughter, which is to say he trusts my judgment and never once says so out loud." Wyatt recognized that dynamic from the inside. "That sounds about right." "It does." She paused. "Does it bother you, not being told?" He thought about his own father, who had expressed approval once in Wyatt's memory. A brief nod after Wyatt had fixed a particularly stubborn irrigation problem at age 16 and had died without repeating it. "You get used to it," he said. "Or you tell yourself you do." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "That's honest." "I'm trying." She glanced at him then, quickly, and there was something in that glance he couldn't entirely read, not quite surprise, something more like recognition. They walked on. The thing about spending time with someone who didn't perform themselves, who didn't arrange their words for effect or manage their reactions for an audience, was that it made you uncomfortably aware of how much other people did, how much Wyatt did, without fully realizing it, the careful non-answers, the deflections dressed as practicality, the whole architecture of a personality built to minimize exposure. Evelyn didn't do any of that. If she thought something, she said it, but without aggression. If she didn't know something, she said that too. When old Mrs. Payne was particularly difficult one afternoon, sharp-tongued and ungrateful in the way of people who had been proud and capable and hated what age had done to them, Evelyn didn't pretend the visit had been pleasant on the walk back. She just said, "She's having a harder time than she lets on," and her voice carried something that wasn't quite pity, because pity would have been condescending, but was in the neighborhood of sorrow, a clean, honest sorrow. Wyatt said, "She's lucky to have someone checking on her." Evelyn said, "Someone should," as though it were that simple. He turned that over in his mind all the way back to the main road. The day that broke something open happened in late July, on a morning when the air already carried the first faint warning of what the coming winter would cost. Wyatt had ridden to the Whitakers to return a borrowed tool and found Gerald and Evelyn in the yard, and the mood was wrong immediately. Gerald's face had the particular closed-down look of a man holding something in, and Evelyn's hands were still in the way that meant she'd stopped whatever she was doing to have a conversation she hadn't planned on. A man was standing near the fence, late 30s, well-dressed for the context, the kind of well-dressed that came from wanting to look like you could afford not to worry about things. His name was Callum Pruitt, and Wyatt knew him by reputation. He ran a moderately successful trading operation out of Fort Collins, had a reputation for fair dealing in business and somewhat less fair dealing in other areas, and he had been widowed 18 months ago. He was talking to Evelyn with the practiced ease of a man who was accustomed to getting what he wanted through the simple mechanism of presenting it as already decided. "I'm not suggesting anything hasty," Pruitt was saying as Wyatt approached. "Just that you'd be well taken care of. My operation is solid. You wouldn't have to." He glanced around the Whitaker yard with an expression that was not quite dismissive, but was doing the work of dismissive while maintaining deniability. "Work this hard." Evelyn's voice when she answered was very level. "I don't mind the work, Mr. Pruitt." "Of course not. I just mean, I know what you mean." Still level, still polite. But the set of her shoulders had changed, and Wyatt, who had been watching her for weeks now with the focused attention of a man trying to learn a language, saw it. Gerald saw Wyatt and said, more loudly than necessary, "Mercer, good timing. Come take a look at that hinge we were discussing." There was no hinge they had been discussing. Wyatt understood that. He walked forward, and Pruitt turned, and the two men looked at each other for a moment in the way men do when they are assessing something without naming it. "Mercer," Pruitt said. "Pruitt." Wyatt nodded. The exchange contained about 40% of the actual conversation. Pruitt stayed another 20 minutes, said everything again in slightly different arrangements, and then climbed onto his horse and rode west. Gerald watched him go with an expression that revealed nothing. Evelyn went back to whatever she'd been doing before. Wyatt picked up a hinge from the tool bench. There actually was one there, lying loose, whether by coincidence or Gerald's foresight, and pretended to examine it. Gerald stood beside him and said quietly, "He's not the first." Wyatt kept looking at the hinge. "No?" "She's a capable woman of marrying age in a community that has more men than women. The arithmetic is not complicated." Gerald was quiet for a moment. "She's turned down 4 men in 3 years. Politely, but clearly." "Why are you telling me this?" Wyatt asked, though he suspected the answer. Gerald was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Because I'm her father, and I know my daughter, and I'm old enough to know that some things need saying before the moment for saying them is gone." He walked back toward his field without waiting for a response. Wyatt stood there with a hinge in his hand, and the yard was quiet, and from inside the house he could hear Evelyn moving, the ordinary sound of someone going about their life. He thought about Pruitt's expression when he'd looked at the Whitaker yard. Work this hard. As if the life Evelyn was living was a problem to be solved rather than a thing she'd built. He thought about Gerald saying, "I know my daughter," with the quiet certainty of a man stating a geographic fact. He thought about himself, 9 years building a ranch alone, lying awake at night telling himself he had enough. He rode home that afternoon in silence, and that evening he sat on the porch of his ranch house and watched the light leave the sky and thought about his life with more honesty than he usually allowed himself. The land he'd built, the operation he'd created, the house he'd never once looked at and thought about who else might live in it. He had been so focused on not wanting things he couldn't have that he'd stopped noticing that some things were actually available, that they had been available, that a reasonable man would have noticed this sooner. He thought about Evelyn saying someone should, as though showing up for people who needed you was simply the obvious choice, and the only thing to decide was whether you were the kind of person who made it. He thought about Thomas Bell telling him he'd forgotten how to open his hands. He sat there until the dark was full and the stars came out over the mountains, and he didn't come to any clean conclusion, because real things don't resolve cleanly. But something settled in him that night. Not a decision exactly, more like the acceptance of something he'd been refusing to look at directly. He was in love with Evelyn Whitaker. Not in the dramatic, sudden way of stories, in the quiet, accumulated way of someone who had been paying attention without admitting it, in the way of a man who finally looked at what had been in front of him and recognized it for what it was. And that recognition, instead of feeling like freedom, sat in his chest like a stone. Because knowing what you felt was the easy part. What came next was harder. And Wyatt Mercer, for all his capability with land and cattle and the hard physical work of survival, had very little practice with what came next. He was 31 years old, and he felt like a man standing at the edge of his own property, looking out at territory he hadn't mapped and didn't fully understand, knowing the only way to know it was to cross over and see what was there. He wasn't sure he was brave enough. He wasn't sure he wasn't. He went inside. He tried to sleep. The house was quiet around him, and outside the creek moved in the dark, steady and indifferent, going wherever water goes. He almost didn't go to her the next morning. That was the honest version of what happened, and Wyatt had spent enough years lying to himself that honesty, even private honesty, had started to feel like a discipline worth keeping. He woke up with the same feeling he'd gone to bed with, that stone in the chest, that specific awareness of something known and not yet acted on. And for a full hour he went about his morning routine and told himself that nothing had changed, and he had work to do, and the feeling would pass. It didn't pass. Cord arrived and looked at him the way Cord sometimes looked at him, which was the way a man looked at something that needed maintenance before it became a problem. "You look like you didn't sleep," Cord said. "I slept fine." "Uh-huh." Cord picked up his coffee and left it at that, which was the thing about Cord. He had the rare quality of knowing when a subject was done. They worked the morning without incident. Wyatt was efficient in the mechanical way of a man whose body knows the work well enough to do it without the mind's full participation. His mind was somewhere else entirely, turning over the previous afternoon, Gerald's words, Pruitt's expression, the set of Evelyn's shoulders when she was saying no to something she had clearly said no to before. Around mid-morning, Wyatt made a decision. He didn't announce it to anyone. He just put down what he was doing and went to saddle his horse. Cord watched him go and said nothing. The ride to the Whitaker property took 12 minutes. Wyatt counted them without meaning to. Evelyn was in the kitchen garden, which he could see from the fence line before she saw him. She was staking up a row of late beans that had grown sideways from the wind, working quickly and with the mild irritation of someone dealing with a problem that could have been prevented. She had tied her hair back, but a substantial portion of it had escaped, and she pushed it out of her face with her forearm, the same gesture he'd watched across the creek that first afternoon, and went back to the beans without losing her place. He stood at the garden fence and watched her for exactly as long as it took her to realize someone was there, which was about 10 seconds. She looked up. Her expression shifted through three things quickly: recognition, surprise, and something more guarded that he couldn't fully read. "Wyatt." "Morning." He gestured at the beans. "Wind got them?" "3 days ago. I've been meaning to stake them since Thursday and kept finding other things to do first." She straightened up and looked at him more directly. "You're here early. I wanted to ask you something." A small pause. "All right." This was the moment where he should have known what to say. He had thought about this on the ride over, or thought he had, but now that he was standing in front of her with the morning light coming sideways across the mountains and the beans sagging off their stakes between them, everything he'd assembled sounded wrong, too formal, too much like a business arrangement, not enough like what it actually was. He said, "Would you walk with me sometime? Not for a neighbor, just for the walking." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment, long enough that he became aware of the sound of the wind and a rooster somewhere distant and his own heartbeat, which was behaving in a way he found professionally embarrassing. Then she said, "I've been walking with you for 6 weeks. I know. I want to keep doing that. I want to do it on purpose. Another pause. The careful kind. Wyatt, she said, what are you asking me? And because she was the kind of person who valued directness over comfort, and because he'd watched her for weeks and understood that about her, he gave her the honest version. I'm asking if you'd consider, if there's any chance you'd want. He stopped, tried again. I'm not good at this. I noticed, she said, but not unkindly. I've been thinking about you, he said, for longer than I admitted to myself. And I know I know it doesn't obligate you to anything. I just wanted you to know it, because not saying it felt worse than saying it wrong. The garden was quiet. A cloud moved across the sun and moved on. Evelyn set down the stake she was holding. She looked at the ground for a moment, then back up at him, and her expression had changed to something he couldn't categorize. Not quite the polite smile, not quite the direct look she used when she was making a practical point. Something more private than either. You sat across from me at my family's table 4 times in the past year, she said. You helped my father with the East Ditch for an entire afternoon and didn't ask for a thing. You walked with me to Mrs. Payne's twice and didn't once complain about her being difficult, which she absolutely was. She paused. I've been waiting for you to figure out what you were doing. He stared at her. You knew? I suspected. The corner of her mouth moved. I wasn't entirely sure until this morning. He let that settle. That is the most aggravating thing anyone has said to me in years. She laughed then. A real one, the unplanned kind. And it broke the tension so cleanly that he felt his shoulders drop from a position he hadn't realized he'd been holding them in. Yes, she said when the laugh had settled. To the walking, on purpose. He nodded. He looked at the beans. You want help with those? I'd actually like that, she said, and handed him a stake. They spent 40 minutes in the garden saying very little, working side by side in the easy silence of 2 people who had somehow, without planning it, already learned how to share a space. When he left, he felt lighter than he had in years. Not because anything was resolved, nothing about life resolved cleanly, but because the weight of not saying something had been exchanged for the lighter, different weight of having said it. That, he was discovering, was progress. What followed were the best weeks of Wyatt's adult life, which is not to say they were uncomplicated. Frontier life didn't pause for personal developments. The cattle still needed managing. The fences still broke. The work was still there every morning waiting for him, patient and indifferent. But there was something new threaded through the routine now. Something he was ashamed to have gone so long without. He walked with Evelyn 3 times a week, sometimes 4. The rounds to the neighbors continued, and he went with her, but the purpose had shifted, and they both knew it even when neither of them said so. The conversations deepened in the way conversations do when the people having them have stopped pretending they're strangers. He learned things. He learned that she'd wanted to be a teacher when she was young, had read everything she could find about the teachers' programs in Denver, and had quietly, over a period of 2 years, let that particular future go as her mother's health declined and the family's need for her became practical and immediate. She told him this without bitterness, which impressed him. She told him it had been a choice she'd made, and that choices were different from things done to you. Do you regret it? He asked. They were sitting by the creek, their creek. He'd started thinking of it that way and recognized that was a telling development, and the afternoon was cooling toward evening. Sometimes, she said, less than I expected to. She picked up a flat stone and turned it over. I think I used to believe you could only live one version of your life, that choosing one thing meant losing everything else completely. He looked at her. What do you believe now? She set the stone down. That you carry the things you didn't choose differently than you thought you would. They don't disappear, they just find other shapes. She glanced at him. Does that make sense? More than you'd think, he said quietly. She was also, he discovered, someone who didn't accept being wrong gracefully, which made her more real to him, not less. When she gave him advice about his summer pasture rotation that turned out to be based on a misunderstanding of his specific soil composition, and he showed her why, she went quiet for a moment in the particular way of someone processing the injury to their confidence, and then said, You should have told me I was off. You seemed sure. That doesn't mean you couldn't tell me. She looked at him steadily. Don't protect me from being wrong, Wyatt. I'd rather be corrected than confident about the wrong thing. He remembered that, filed it away as one of the most useful things anyone had said to him in years. In early September, the first real indication of what the winter would bring arrived in the form of a cold front that came down from the north and didn't leave. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in 2 days. The creek ran fast and dark with runoff from early mountain snow, and in town, the men who paid attention to these things exchanged looks that did not require words. It was going to be a hard winter. The ranchers and farmers around Red Hollow began the particular urgent work of preparation, reinforcing barns, laying in feed, checking water systems before they froze, making the 100 quiet decisions that could mean the difference between a herd that survived and one that didn't. Wyatt worked 18-hour days. Cord worked alongside him without complaint, which Wyatt would remember and not forget. On a Saturday afternoon, when the sky had gone the specific flat gray of incoming weather and the wind was coming off the mountains with a seriousness that hadn't been there a week ago, Wyatt crossed the creek to help the Whitakers with their barn. Gerald had been in the field since dawn. His eldest son, Martin, who usually came down from Greeley for the hard seasons, had sent word that he was delayed by problems of his own and wouldn't arrive until November at the earliest. That left Gerald and Evelyn and a teenage boy from town who helped with heavy work, and it wasn't enough. Wyatt brought Cord. They arrived to find Evelyn on top of the barn roof, replacing split shingles with a focus that did not acknowledge the fact that the wind had picked up considerably since morning. Cord looked up at her and then at Wyatt. She do this often? Apparently, Wyatt said, and started up the ladder. She heard him coming and didn't look up. I've got this section. East side needs the most work. I'll take the east side. I can... Evelyn. He was on the roof now, on the slope just below her, looking up. Let me take the east side. She looked at him, evaluated, made the practical calculation. There's a bad section near the vent pipe, she said. Don't step on it directly. Understood. They worked the roof for 2 hours while Cord and Gerald reinforced the barn's north wall below. The wind made everything harder. Shingles that wanted to slide, nails that were difficult to set cleanly, footing that required constant attention. Wyatt did not love being on a roof in 30-degree wind. He also noticed that Evelyn's hands were red from the cold, and she hadn't acknowledged this once. You need gloves, he said. I had them. I took them off to get better grip on the nails. That's a terrible trade. It worked, though. He took off his own gloves and held them out. She looked at them. Then your hands will be cold. My hands are harder. That's not a good reason. It's a practical reason. She took the gloves, which confirmed something he'd come to understand about her. She was not sentimental about accepting help when the help was logical. She just needed the logic to be sound. By the time they came down off the roof, the temperature had dropped another 5 degrees and Gerald had started a fire in the barn stove. They stood around it, all 4 of them, while the first true cold of the season pressed against the barn walls and the wind moved through the eave gaps with a low sound that promised more where it came from. Storm's going to hit the northern ranges first, Gerald said, looking at nothing. Then come down. 3 days, Cord said. Maybe 4. 2, Evelyn said. They all looked at her. She shrugged. The temperature dropped too fast. When it drops that fast, it means the front is already closer than it looks. 2 days, maybe less. She looked at her father. We need to move the sheep into the lower pen tonight. Gerald didn't argue. He just nodded. Wyatt watched this exchange and felt something he couldn't entirely name. Something in the neighborhood of admiration, but more specific than that. The watching of someone in their element, genuinely, usefully in their element, doing the thing they were made to understand. She was right about the storm. It arrived in a day and a half. What followed was the hardest week most of Red Hollow had seen in years. The storm hit the northern ranges first, as Evelyn had predicted, and came south with the kind of sustained, grinding force that didn't announce itself as temporary. Fences went down under the weight of ice. 2 of Emmett's cattle got through a broken section and wandered before being found. The Dawson family's well pump froze and took 2 days to thaw enough to function. Wyatt and Evelyn worked through it together, And that was the thing that changed everything between them in a way that all the walks and conversations had been building toward but hadn't quite achieved. Not the romance of it. There was nothing romantic about the storm. It was cold and exhausting and unpleasant in the specific way of work that can't wait for you to be ready for it. But the partnership of it, the way they moved around each other's decisions without collision. The way she knew, without being told, that when Wyatt said the south fence line was the priority, he'd already calculated why, and she didn't need to re-examine it. The way he understood, when she said the Dawson family needed the well thawed before anything else on the second day, that she'd already weighted against all the other demands and come out on the right side. On the third day of the storm, they spent 6 hours cutting a path through a section of fencing that had come down under the weight of ice accumulation, letting 4 of Wyatt's cattle through onto Whitaker land. Moving them back required cold, tedious work and visibility that wasn't good enough for comfort. At one point, a post they'd been working to free shifted unexpectedly, and the wire snapped back, catching Wyatt across the back of his left hand. He swore, examined the cut, not deep but long, and wrapped his handkerchief around it. Evelyn saw. She grabbed his wrist without asking and unwrapped the handkerchief to look. "It's fine," he said. "I can see that. Hold still." She rewrapped it tighter, efficiently, and looked up at him from under the brim of her hat. "Your hands are harder," she said with the slight emphasis of someone quoting something back. He almost smiled. "Told you." She released his wrist and went back to the fencing, and they worked on, and the storm didn't care, and the cattle were eventually moved, and by the end of that day both of them were dirty and cold and tired in the profound, cellular way of people who have spent everything they had. They stood at the fence line in the low gray light of a cloud-covered late afternoon, looking at what they'd accomplished, which from a distance looked like a repaired fence in bad weather, and from the inside felt like considerably more than that. "You didn't have to help with ours," Evelyn said. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the fence. "Your cattle and mine use the same water source," Wyatt said. "It wasn't charity. It was practical." She was quiet for a moment. "Is that the only reason?" He looked at her. The cold had put color in her cheeks, and her breath was visible in the air, and she had ice crystals in her hair from where she'd pushed her hat back an hour ago and forgotten to pull it forward again. "No," he said. She looked at him then, and whatever she found in his face seemed to satisfy some internal question she'd been carrying, because the guarded thing he sometimes saw in her expression wasn't there. Just her. Just the direct, clear-eyed look of a woman who had learned not to accept things at less than their actual value. "Good," she said. They walked back to the barn in the cooling evening, and the cold came down around them, and neither of them said anything else. And that was enough. That was more than enough. That was Wyatt understood walking through the frozen mud in the last gray light of that hard day, the most honest conversation he had ever had with another person about the condition of his own heart. 2 words. Neither of them the ones you'd expect. And somewhere between the broken fence and the cattle and the ice and the long cold work of a storm that didn't care what it cost, between all of that ordinary, grinding, unglamorous reality, something had been decided, not announced, not ceremonized, just decided, the way real things were. That night, Wyatt sat in his ranch house and the fire was going and the storm had finally begun to ease, the wind dropping its voice from a shout to a conversation, and he looked at the room around him the way he had never quite looked at it before. The table with 1 chair, the window that faced the creek, the walls he'd repaired and the floor he'd replaced, and the whole careful, functional, solitary space he'd constructed around the specific dimensions of a life lived alone. He thought, this room is the wrong size. Not too small, not too large, just calibrated for one person, in every small detail, in a way that had made complete sense 6 months ago and now felt like a mistake he could actually correct. He sat with that thought for a long time, listening to the wind come down from quieter. Outside, the creek was running fast under its thin ice, cold and persistent, going wherever it was going, same as always. And yet, the storm left behind a landscape that looked like it had been wrung out and dropped. Fences leaned at angles they hadn't been built to hold. The creek ran high and brown with snowmelt from the upper ranges. 3 inches of ice had formed overnight on the water troughs. And every morning for a week, Wyatt broke it with a sledgehammer before the cattle could drink, his breath coming in clouds, his boots finding the mud underneath the frozen surface where the ground hadn't quite decided what season it was. Red Hollow took stock of itself in the quiet after the storm and found that it had come through, but barely, and not without cost. The Henderson barn had lost a section of roof. Two of the Payne family's outlying pastures had flooded badly enough to kill the winter grass. An older couple east of town, the Garfields, had spent 3 days without adequate firewood before Evelyn, who had apparently kept a mental register of every vulnerable household within 5 miles, organized a delivery that nobody had asked her to organize. Wyatt heard about this from Cord, who heard it from his sister, which was the standard intelligence channel for anything Evelyn did that she didn't talk about herself. She showed up at the Garfields with 2 cords of wood and your neighbor's boy driving the wagon, Cord said. He was replacing a broken wheel spoke and not looking up. Apparently old Roy Garfield tried to argue with her about accepting it. How'd that go for him, Wyatt said. About how you'd expect. Wyatt could picture it exactly. Evelyn standing in the Garfield's yard with the patient, immovable quality of someone who had already done the math and was just waiting for the other person to catch up. Roy Garfield was a proud, stubborn man in his late 60s who had been taking care of himself since before Evelyn was born. He would have hated needing the help. He would have hated accepting it more, and she would have found a way to make it feel less like charity and more like a neighbor returning something owed, because that was how she operated. She made it easier to accept things from her than it should have been, and Wyatt suspected this was not accidental. He thought about this while he broke ice off water troughs and repaired fencing and did the 100 tasks the post-storm recovery demanded. He thought about the room in his house with 1 chair. He thought about the wrong-size feeling he'd been sitting with since the night the wind came down. He didn't tell anyone about that feeling. It wasn't the kind of thing he talked about, but it was the kind of thing that accumulates pressure over time, and pressure, as any rancher understood, eventually found its outlet one way or another. The outlet, in this case, turned out to be a window. It happened on a Saturday in late October, the kind of cold, clear day that arrived occasionally in the space between storms and felt like a gift that came with no strings. And pressure, as any rancher understood, eventually found its outlet one way or another. The outlet, in this case, turned out to be a window. It happened on a Saturday in late October, the kind of cold, clear day that arrived occasionally in the space between storms and felt like a gift that came with no strings. Wyatt had finished his morning work early and found himself standing in the ranch house kitchen looking at the north-facing window above the sink, a small window, badly placed, that let in almost no useful light and had a cracked pane he'd been meaning to replace for 2 years. He replaced it that afternoon, but he didn't stop there. The window was the wrong size, he realized, once he'd pulled the old frame out. Or rather, it was the right size for a man who used the kitchen only for the functional necessity of eating and had no particular investment in what the room felt like. He stood there with the old frame in his hands and the cold air coming through the gap and looked at the wall and thought about what a different-sized window would let in. He rode to town for a larger frame the following Monday. Cord noticed the new window going in on Tuesday and said nothing. He was perceptive enough to understand that the window was not really about the window, and he was wise enough not to say so. Wyatt understood, partway through setting the new frame, that he had started something. The window looked better, but it made the wall beside it look shabby by comparison, which made the floor look dark, which made the entire room reveal itself as a space that had been furnished with pure function and zero thought for what it might feel like to spend time in. He spent November fixing it. He was not a man who renovated out of aesthetic vanity. That wasn't what was happening. He was a man who had looked at something honest and understood what it would need to be. The kitchen got a wider window, and the walls got fresh whitewash, and the floor got cleaned to a standard it had never previously been held to. The main room got a second chair, which he purchased from the supply store in town without explaining himself to anyone, and which sat beside the fireplace at an angle that made the room feel different, more complete, like a sentence with its subject restored. The bedroom he left alone for now. That felt like a line he wasn't ready to cross yet. He did not tell Evelyn any of this. This was deliberate. He understood that words were easy, and he had a long history of using practical silence as a substitute for genuine expression. But this was different. This was the opposite of silence. This was the loudest thing he'd done in years, just in a language he'd never used before. He wanted to see if she could read it. They continued their walks through November, though the cold made them shorter and the terrain less forgiving. Sometimes Evelyn brought her younger sister, Clara, a 14-year-old with her mother's coloring and an opinion about everything that she expressed with a directness that reminded Wyatt uncomfortably of Thomas Bell. "You like my sister," Clara announced on one of these walks, falling into step beside Wyatt while Evelyn was ahead, checking on a section of road that had washed out. "Your sister is a good person," Wyatt said. "That's not what I said." "It's what I answered." Clara considered this. "She likes you too, in case you were wondering." "Clara," Evelyn said from up ahead, without turning around. "I'm just making conversation," Clara said. "You're doing something else, and you know it." Clara grinned. She looked back at Wyatt with the satisfied expression of someone who had accomplished what they set out to accomplish, regardless of how the conversation had officially gone, and then skipped ahead to walk beside her sister. Wyatt watched them together. Evelyn's measured stride and Clara's bouncing energy, the ease between them that came from years of shared space and shared work, and the specific bond of siblings who had been through hard things together and felt the wrong size feeling again. Not the absence of something. More like the space where something was supposed to be and would eventually be if he could stop getting in his own way. He was working on that. Gerald Whitaker came to the ranch house on a Thursday in early December, which was unusual enough in itself. Gerald did not make social calls. He came when there was a purpose. Wyatt met him at the door and read his face, which was doing the careful close-down thing it did when Gerald was carrying something he'd thought about for a while and had decided it needed saying. "Come in," Wyatt said. Gerald came in. He stood in the main room and looked at the two chairs by the fire and the whitewashed kitchen wall visible through the doorway, and his expression did something brief and unreadable before settling back to neutral. "Coffee?" Wyatt offered. "Thank you." They sat with the coffee for a moment in the silence of two men who understood that the conversation would start when it started and not before. Gerald said, "I want to know your intentions toward my daughter." Wyatt had expected this, and not expected it. He set his cup down. "I intend to ask permission to court her properly." "You've been courting her for 3 months." "I know." He met Gerald's eyes. "I should have come to you sooner." Gerald looked at him steadily. "Why didn't you?" And because Gerald was the kind of man who deserved an honest answer, Wyatt gave him one. "I wasn't sure enough of myself. I didn't want to make a claim I wasn't certain I could follow through on." "And now?" "Now I'm certain." Gerald was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. Outside, the wind had picked up again, coming off the mountains with the low, sustained note of a season that had fully committed to itself. "Evelyn is not a woman who needs managing," Gerald said, finally. "She never was. She'll tell you when she thinks you're wrong. She'll work alongside you, but she won't work behind you. She'll give everything she has, and she'll expect the same in return, and she will notice if she's not getting it." "I know," Wyatt said. "Do you?" Gerald looked at him with the direct evaluating look he used on fields he was considering planting. "Because she's had men sit in front of me before, and they thought they knew too. And what they actually knew was their own idea of her, which was a different thing." Wyatt thought about that. What they knew was someone who could fit into the life they already had. Gerald's expression shifted slightly. "That's right. That's not what I'm asking for." Wyatt looked at the two chairs by the fire. "I'm trying to build a life she could actually want to be part of, not bring her into a space that's already finished." Gerald followed his gaze. He was quiet for a long moment. "She'd want to do some of the building herself," he said. "I know that too." Another silence. Gerald set down his coffee. "You have my blessing," he said. The word came out slightly awkward, the way it does from a man who doesn't use it often. "For what that's worth." "It's worth a great deal," Wyatt said. Gerald nodded. He stood up, picked up his hat, and went to the door. He paused there with his hand on the frame. "She turned down Pruitt again last month," he said without looking back. "He came a second time. She wasn't unkind about it, but she was clear." He put his hat on. I'm telling you that because I think you should know, not to put pressure. I understand. Gerald went out into the cold. Wyatt sat by the fire for a long time after that, finishing his coffee and staring at the two chairs and thinking about the word building, the way he'd used it, and the way Gerald had received it, and the distinction between a life that was constructed and a life that was grown. He'd spent 9 years constructing. He was only beginning to understand what growing something required. It required staying when staying was uncomfortable. It required saying things you weren't ready to say because the moment had arrived regardless of readiness. It required the specific courage of people who were not otherwise afraid. Not the courage of danger, but the courage of exposure. The courage of being seen clearly by someone you cared about and letting them make their own decision about what they saw. He had not been good at that. He was trying to get better. He went to see Evelyn 2 days later, on a clear Saturday morning when the ground was frozen solid and the sky was the flat pale blue of deep winter. She was in the yard doing something practical, because she was always doing something practical, and she looked up when he came through the fence gate. "My father said you came by?" she said. "I did." She waited. "I asked him for permission to court you officially." He stood in the yard with his hands not entirely sure what to do with themselves. "He said yes, in case you were wondering." Evelyn looked at him steadily. "I know he said yes. He told me yesterday." Wyatt blinked. "He told you?" "He tells me most things." She tilted her head slightly. "Did you think he wouldn't?" He stopped. The image he'd had of presenting this to her as something arranged and settled rearranged itself awkwardly. "I suppose I thought I'd be the one telling you." "You are the one telling me," she said. "Papa told me a man was going to ask. You're the one telling me it was you." She set down what she was holding. "How does it feel?" "Which part?" "Coming here, saying it out loud." He thought about it. "Less terrifying than I expected. More," he searched for the word. "Real." She considered that. Something moved in her expression that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood. "For what it's worth," she said, "I would have told you yes 3 months ago if you'd managed to ask." "I know," he said, with the specific rueful quality of a man accepting an earned observation. "I'm aware I took the scenic route." She laughed, short and genuine. "Come inside. I'll make coffee, and you can explain to me why you put a new window in your kitchen." He stopped. "How do you know about the window?" "Clara saw it when she rode past your property last week." Evelyn turned toward the house. "She has strong opinions about it." "Of course she does. She thinks it's too big." "It's the right size," Wyatt said, following her. "That's what I told her." He stopped in the doorway. "You defended my window?" Evelyn glanced back at him, and this time it was the actual smile. The real one, unplanned, the one he'd watched from across a creek the first afternoon and not understood the significance of. "I had a feeling it was about more than the window," she said simply, and went inside. He stood in the doorway for a moment in the winter cold, and then he followed her in. The weeks between that conversation and Christmas were the weeks Wyatt would remember most clearly in the years that followed, not because anything dramatic happened, but because of the specific quality of things that don't need to be dramatic to matter. They were the weeks of figuring out how two people who had been entirely independent for their entire adult lives began the complicated daily work of making room for each other. It was not seamless. Nothing real ever was. He had habits she found baffling, the way he made decisions by himself and announced them afterward, as though the deciding and the telling were two separate steps that didn't need to overlap. She called him on it the first time it happened. "You already decided we'd ride out to check the Henderson fence together on Friday," she said, without asking if Friday worked. "Does Friday work?" "That's not the point." "Does it work, though?" "Wyatt, I'm asking." She looked at him. "Friday works, but next time ask first." "Right," he said. He meant it. He also did the same thing 3 weeks later, caught himself partway through, and said, "Would Thursday work, or would you prefer a different—" before she stopped him with a look that was half exasperation and half something warmer. Thursday's fine, she said. I'm working on it, he said. I know you are. She had her own version of this. The way she sometimes made a decision about something that affected both of them and then presented it as already done, because she was so accustomed to being the person who handled things that the habit of consulting anyone was genuinely new to her. The first time he pointed this out, she went quiet in the particular way she did when something landed accurately and then said, I didn't realize I was doing that. It's all right. It's not, actually. I'd want you to tell me. She looked at him with the directness that was one of the things he valued most about her. I don't want to be the person who manages things. I want to be the person who does things with someone. He understood the distinction. All right. We're both going to keep doing this, she said. The wrong thing, and having to correct it. Probably. Does that bother you? He thought about what it would mean if it did. A life calibrated to avoid difficulty was a life calibrated to avoid most of the things that mattered. He had lived that life. He knew what it felt like from the inside. No, he said honestly. It means it's real. She nodded slowly. It means it's real, she agreed. The ring came from a box in the back of Wyatt's closet, wrapped in a piece of cloth he hadn't touched in 12 years. His mother's ring. A simple thing. A narrow gold band with a small stone that wasn't a diamond, wasn't trying to be, was exactly what it was. He'd put it away when she died and not thought about it in years, and then one night in late November he'd gone looking for a misplaced piece of tack leather and found the box instead, and sat on the floor of his closet in the dark for a while with it in his hand. He'd known, sitting there, what he was going to do with it, but he didn't do it yet. Not because he was afraid this time, or not only because of that, but because he understood that the moment mattered and the moment needed to be right. Not perfect. He'd given up on perfect as a standard some months ago, but right. December came fully, cold and bright and hard-frosted every morning. The ranch settled into its winter rhythm. The cattle were in the lower pastures, the water systems held. Cord took a week to visit family in Pueblo and came back quieter and more settled than he'd left, which Wyatt took as a good sign about whatever had happened there. Life moved at the speed it moved, and Wyatt paid attention to it with a sharpness he hadn't had before, as though the act of acknowledging what he wanted had calibrated something in him that had been slightly off for years. He noticed the quality of light in the early mornings. He noticed the way the creek looked different under different skies. He noticed, when Evelyn was talking, the precise moment when she shifted from saying what was practical to saying what she actually thought, and he learned to wait for that moment and receive it carefully. He was, he understood, a late student of being alive. But he was learning. On an afternoon in late December, when the mountains caught the last sun and held it for a moment before dark, that specific northern Colorado light that looked like something on fire, deciding to be gentle instead, Wyatt rode to the Whitaker property and found Evelyn by the creek. She was standing at the water's edge, looking at something on the other bank. A deer, it turned out, that moved off into the trees as Wyatt approached. "You spooked it," she said, without accusation. "Sorry." He stood beside her and watched the place where the deer had been. The creek ran between ice at its edges and open water in the center, the current dark and quick. The mountains above them held their snow. The sky was the color that comes after all the color has been used. "I have something for you," Wyatt said. Evelyn looked at him. He took the ring from his coat pocket. He had not rehearsed what he was going to say, because rehearsed things came out wrong from him, and he knew that about himself by now. He just looked at her in the last light, this woman who fixed roofs in the cold and read weather patterns and corrected him when he was wrong and laughed like something that caught her off guard, and he said what was true. "I spent a long time convincing myself I didn't need more than I had, that keeping everything small was the same as keeping it safe." He paused. "I was wrong about that. And you're the thing that made me see I was wrong, not because you tried to, just because you were—" He stopped again. He was not a man who spoke fluently about interior things, and he was not going to pretend otherwise. "You made me want more than I was settling for. You made me think I could build something worth having." Evelyn was looking at him with the expression she had that he couldn't fully categorize, the private one, the one that wasn't for anyone else. "Wyatt," she said. "I know I took too long," he said. I know I don't say the right things in the right order. I make decisions without asking first, and I'm better at fixing fences than talking about what I feel. He looked down at the ring. But I will spend however long it takes learning to do better, if you'll let me. The creek moved between them, and the last light was going, and somewhere in the trees the deer had stopped moving, and the world was very quiet. Evelyn reached out and took the ring from his hand, and she turned it over once and looked at it for a moment that felt to Wyatt like the longest and most important moment of his life. Then she said, "Your mother's?" "Yes." She looked up at him. "You should have seen your face when you found me by the creek that first summer," she said. "That afternoon you were fixing the fence. You stood there with a post in your hand, and you looked at me like you didn't recognize yourself." He remembered. "I didn't." "I know." She was quiet for a second. "I saw it, and I thought—" She stopped, looked back at the ring, looked at him. "I thought, well, he's going to take a while, but he'll get there." She put the ring on her own finger, and it fit, which felt like something, though he couldn't have said exactly what. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." He let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. She looked at him with the real smile, the unplanned one, and shook her head slowly. "You took so long, Wyatt Mercer." "I know. Don't do that again." "I won't," he said, and meant it. The mountains held their snow above them. The creek ran on. They stood together at the edge of the water in the last light of a December afternoon, and it was cold. And it was not a perfect moment, and it was entirely and completely enough. The news moved through Red Hollow, the way news always moved through small places, not through any single announcement, but through the accumulation of small observations that people assembled into the obvious conclusion before anyone said it outright. Wyatt Mercer's horse tied outside the Whitaker property 3 mornings in a row. Evelyn wearing a ring that hadn't been there the week before. Gerald Whitaker buying a round at the saloon on a Tuesday, which he had never done in recorded memory. By the time Wyatt and Evelyn told anyone officially, most of Red Hollow already knew and had already decided how they felt about it, which was, with the exception of Callum Pruitt, who was reportedly philosophical about it in the way of a man who had placed a bet and lost and was determined not to show the loss, entirely positive. Thomas Bell heard about it and sent word through Cord that he was glad someone had finally done something sensible, which was the closest Thomas came to congratulations, and was received in that spirit. Clara Whitaker, when told formally, said, finally, with such conviction that even Gerald had to look away to hide his expression. Margaret Whitaker cried, which surprised everyone, including herself. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands around a cup of tea and her eyes wet and her voice entirely steady, and said, "I've been hoping for this for 2 years. I just didn't want to say it out loud in case it didn't happen." She looked at Wyatt across the table. "You take care of her." "Yes, ma'am," Wyatt said. "And let her take care of you," Margaret added. "That part matters too. Men always forget that part." Wyatt glanced at Evelyn, who was looking at her mother with the expression she wore when someone said something exactly right. "I won't forget," he said. He meant that too. They set the wedding for March, which gave them the winter to prepare and gave the ground time to be workable again for the guests who would need to travel. It was a practical timeline, which suited both of them, and it also gave Wyatt time to finish what he'd started in the ranch house. Though Evelyn, once informed of the renovations, had opinions. She came to the house for the first time with genuine-looking intent in January, on a gray afternoon when the snow was coming down in the soft, purposeless way it sometimes did, as though the sky couldn't quite commit. She walked through every room with the focused attention she gave to things that mattered, and Wyatt walked with her and said almost nothing, because this felt like one of those moments where the right thing was to let it land however it landed. She stopped in the kitchen and looked at the new window, the larger one, the one that let the light in properly. "It's good," she said. "I know what you're going to say next," he said. "The wall beside it needs—" "I know. I ordered the lumber last week." She looked at him sideways. "You were going to fix it anyway." "I was always going to fix it." She walked on into the main room and stood by the 2 chairs at the fireplace. She was quiet for a moment, then, "You put the second chair in before you asked me." "Yes." "Why?" He thought about how to answer that honestly, because I needed to see if I was actually capable of making room, or if I'd just convinced myself I was. She looked at the chairs for another moment, and, sitting in one and looking at the other one empty was one of the more uncomfortable weeks I've had, he said. The corner of her mouth moved. She walked on. She had two significant objections to the house as it stood, both of which were correct. The north-facing bedroom window was badly positioned for ventilation in the summer. She knew this before she'd even looked at it closely, because she'd observed the wind patterns around the building on multiple occasions across multiple seasons, which was a thing she had done without knowing she was doing it or why. And the storage room off the main hallway was being wasted. Organized, technically, but organized around one person's workflow in a way that made it half as useful as it could be. Both things were fixable. They fixed them together over the course of February, which turned out to be one of the better decisions of the process. Not because two people working together was always more efficient, because it often wasn't, but because the work of making a space shared was itself the lesson. You couldn't build a life for two people by yourself. You had to actually do it with them. Wyatt learned this in the specific way that people learn things they should theoretically already know, which is through the experience of getting it wrong first. He moved the storage room shelving to what he'd considered the logical configuration, and Evelyn looked at it and said, "That works if you're the only one using it. What's wrong with it?" She showed him. It took about 3 minutes. He moved the shelving. She tried to plan the kitchen reorganization without asking where he kept things, and discovered that his system, while completely opaque from the outside, had an internal logic she hadn't accounted for. "Why is the salt here?" she asked. "Because it's next to where I stand when I'm cooking." "You stand there? Where else would I stand?" She looked at the configuration, made a sound that was not quite agreement. "We'll need to talk about this." "We're talking about it right now." "I mean properly, with both of us standing in the kitchen at the same time, actually cooking. When have we ever cooked together?" "We haven't," she said. "That's going to be a problem we discover in real time." She was right. They cooked together for the first time in late February, making a meal for Gerald and Margaret and Clara, who had come to see the house's progress, and the kitchen turned out to be exactly the negotiation Evelyn had predicted. Two people with established independent habits trying to occupy the same small space with knives and hot iron and different ideas about timing. Clara sat at the kitchen table and watched with the delighted attention of someone at a sporting event. "You're in each other's way," she offered helpfully. "We know," they said in unison, which was the first time that had happened and which Clara found unreasonably funny. The meal was good, in the end. Not because the process had been smooth, but because they'd figured it out mid-process, adjusting, getting out of each other's way, discovering the small choreography of shared space that can't be planned in advance and has to be lived into. Gerald, eating, looked around the kitchen at the new window and the reorganized shelving and the evidence of two people in the middle of building something together, and said nothing. But when he left that night, he put his hand briefly on Wyatt's shoulder, a gesture Wyatt had never received from him before, and that was enough. They were married on a Saturday in late March when the ground was soft and the first real warmth of the year had decided to show up, which nobody had planned for but everybody appreciated. The ceremony was at the Red Hollow Community Hall, because it was large enough, and because Evelyn, when presented with the alternative of a more formal venue in the county seat, had said with characteristic directness that she wanted to get married where the people she actually knew could attend without making a 3-hour round trip. The people she actually knew turned out to be most of the valley. Ranchers came in from the outer properties. The Henderson family came, the father walking without a cane for the first time since the fall. Mrs. Payne attended in her good dress and was difficult about the seating arrangements and cried during the vows, which she denied afterward. Thomas Bell arrived early and stood near the back and shook Wyatt's hand beforehand with a grip that communicated more than the few words he offered. "Took you long enough," Thomas said. "You mentioned that before," Wyatt said. "Worth repeating." Thomas released his hand. "She's a good woman." "I know." "You're a decent man." He said this the way he said everything, flatly, factually, without ceremony. "That's rarer than it sounds." Cord was there, quieter than usual, standing with his sister near the side wall and looking like a man who had been made mildly uncomfortable by the emotion of the occasion and was managing it with dignity. Clara served as Evelyn's attendant and took the role with a seriousness that suggested she had thought about it carefully, which was its own kind of touching. She fussed with Evelyn's dress in the anteroom beforehand in a way that was clearly unnecessary, but clearly necessary, and Evelyn let her. "Are you nervous?" Clara asked. "About the ceremony?" "About any of it." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "No," she said, "not about the part that matters. What are you nervous about?" "Whether the food holds up." She adjusted a pin in her hair. "Mrs. Henderson's potato situation is never quite right." Clara stared at her. "You're thinking about potatoes." "I'm thinking about everything. Potatoes are on the list." Clara shook her head. "You are the strangest person." Evelyn looked at her in the small mirror. "You'll understand when you're older." "I'm 14, not 6. "I know." Evelyn turned. "How do I look?" Clara examined her with the critical honesty of a younger sibling. "Like yourself," she said finally. "But more so." It was, Evelyn decided, the best possible answer. The ceremony itself was straightforward in the way that both of them had wanted. No excess, no performance, the words said clearly, and heard by people who had known them long enough to understand what they actually meant. When Wyatt put his mother's ring, now resized to fit Evelyn's hand properly, on her finger, he did it with a steadiness that surprised him. He had expected to feel the way he felt before difficult conversations, that tight, resistant thing in his chest, but he didn't. He felt standing there what he could only describe as correct, not perfect, not transported, just correct, like something that had been out of alignment for years had finally been set right. Evelyn said her vows without looking down at any paper, which he noticed. She had memorized them, or she hadn't needed to, and either way it meant she had known exactly what she was going to say. Afterward, Thomas Bell said the reception was one of the better ones he'd attended. Given that Thomas had attended roughly 50 years' worth of Red Hollow social events, and considered most of them a waste of time he could have spent working, this constituted a strong review. The years that came after were not the easy years that people sometimes retroactively describe when they talk about the past. Frontier life did not become easier because Wyatt had found a partner. If anything, the first 2 years were harder than the years before, because the operation was expanding and the responsibility had grown, and the ranch was no longer just a thing he needed to maintain, but a thing they were trying to build into something. They lost 8 cattle in the second winter to a disease that came in from the eastern ranches and moved through the valley before anyone understood what they were dealing with. It was the worst financial hit Wyatt had taken since his first year, and he sat with the numbers one evening in January trying not to let his face show what they said. And Evelyn sat across from him and looked at the numbers and said, "We'll cut the expansion plan by a year, keep the cash reserves intact." "We," he said. "Yes." He looked at her. "You were the one who wanted the expansion, and now I'm the one saying we wait." She folded her hands on the table. "The land isn't going anywhere. The plan is good. The timing is flexible." She paused. "Wyatt, we'll be fine." "You don't know that." "No," she said evenly, "but I know that panicking about it doesn't change the numbers, and I know that 2 people handling a bad year are better than 1. She looked at him steadily. "Stop trying to carry this by yourself. We're past that." He put the papers down. "I know we're past that. He stopped. "It's the habit," she said. "Not unkind, just accurate. It comes back when things get hard. You default to a loan." "I'm working on it." "I know you are." She stood up and took the papers from his side of the table and put them on a shelf. "It's February. We're not solving February in one evening. Come eat something." He followed her into the kitchen, and they ate, and the numbers were the same as they'd been, and somehow that was manageable. That was the thing he learned, the thing he couldn't have understood before her, or couldn't have believed if someone had told him. Hard years were still hard. Loss was still loss. The land was still indifferent, and the winters were still dangerous, and the work was still relentless. None of that changed, but the quality of difficulty changed entirely when you stopped absorbing it alone. Not halved. It didn't have. It transformed into something you could actually set down at the end of a day instead of carrying into sleep, into something with edges you could see, instead of a weight that expanded to fill everything. He had spent years believing that attachment was the thing that made loss hurt more, that keeping himself separate was a form of protection. He had been completely wrong about that. Loss didn't hurt more because of love. Loss hurt the same. Love was just what was there on the other side of it. Evelyn built a life in the ranch house that was unmistakably hers without erasing anything that had been his. She brought books, more books than Wyatt had ever owned, stacked on a shelf she'd asked him to build along the east wall of the main room. She brought her mother's recipe box and 2 quilts and a small painted tin that had belonged to her grandmother and contained nothing, as far as anyone could tell, but seemed to matter to her in a way she didn't explain and nobody asked about. She reorganized the kitchen twice in the first year, both times with his input, both times arriving at something more functional than what had been there before. The second chair by the fire became the chair where she sat in the evenings, and he had his. And some nights they talked, and some nights they read, and some nights they simply sat in the same room in the same comfortable silence. And all 3 of those things were, Wyatt discovered, different forms of the same thing. She was right about Mrs. Henderson's potatoes, for the record. Consistently underdone. Cord stayed on for 4 more years before moving back to Pueblo permanently to be closer to his family. And on his last day, Evelyn packed him a meal for the road, and Gerald Whitaker shook his hand, and Wyatt said, "You're a good man, Cord." Cord said, "I know," without any false modesty whatsoever, and rode south. Margaret Whitaker's health stabilized in the 2nd year after the wedding. Not improved dramatically, but found a level that allowed her more good days than bad, which was more than anyone had expected to be able to say. Gerald, freed from the constant underlying worry about her that he'd been carrying for years, became somehow easier to be around. Still quiet, still direct, still the kind of man who expressed approval through action rather than words, but with a looseness to him that Wyatt had never seen before. He visited the ranch house often in those years, always with a purpose, always arriving at productive hours. He would work alongside Wyatt on whatever needed doing, and then drink coffee at the kitchen table and talk to Evelyn about the land with the specific pleasure of 2 people who share a genuine interest. Watching them together, the father and daughter, the ease of it, the shorthand they'd developed over years, Wyatt felt something that was not quite envy and not quite longing, but was in the neighborhood of both. He had not had that with his own father. He was not going to have it now. He had made his peace with that, or was making it, which was the more honest version. Some things didn't resolve. They just became part of what you were. Clara grew up with the speed that teenagers inflict on the people who care about them. At 14, she had been direct and opinionated. At 17, she was direct and opinionated and frighteningly capable. At 19, she left for Denver to pursue the teaching certificate that Evelyn had once quietly let go of, and Evelyn helped her pack and rode with her to the stage stop and hugged her once, firmly, and did not cry until the stage was out of sight. Wyatt was there. He gave her the space to cry without comment. After a moment, Evelyn straightened and said, "She'll be fine." "She will," he agreed. "She's tougher than she looks." "She's exactly as tough as she looks," he said. "Which is very." Evelyn glanced at him, a wet half-laugh. "Yes, that's right." She wiped her face with the back of her hand. "Let's go home." Home. It was still a word that surprised him sometimes, with its weight. 5 years in, they had a daughter. Her name was Ruth, after no one in particular, and both of them in some quality they couldn't name. She was born in April, which felt appropriate. A shoulder-season child, stubborn about arriving when expected, making everyone wait slightly longer than was comfortable, and then appearing with such completeness that the waiting was immediately, entirely forgotten. She had Evelyn's eyes and Wyatt's stubbornness, and a personality that announced itself in the first weeks as a force that was not going to be easily redirected, which Gerald observed with the quiet satisfaction of a man watching something he understood come around again in a new generation. "She's going to give you trouble," Gerald told Wyatt one afternoon, watching Ruth in the yard. "I know," Wyatt said. "Good trouble." "The best kind." Gerald nodded slowly. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're a good father, Wyatt." It was the most Gerald Whitaker had ever said to him directly about anything personal. Wyatt absorbed it without deflecting, which was the thing he'd learned to do. Receive things instead of redirecting them. Let them land. Let them count. I'm trying to be, he said. That's what it takes, Gerald said. Just the trying. The rest follows. It was 7 years after the summer of the broken fence post when Wyatt found himself standing at the south edge of his property on a September afternoon looking at the creek. Ruth was in the yard behind him, running between the fence posts with the specific energy of a 6-year-old who had decided that the goal was simply to run and the destination was irrelevant. He could hear her talking to herself in the way children do, not quite narrating, not quite planning, just thinking out loud because the inside of her head was apparently too small to contain everything at once. Evelyn was coming across the yard toward him, carrying 2 cups of coffee, which he saw before she saw him watching. She walked the way she always had, purposeful, unhurried, as though she had allocated exactly the right amount of time for wherever she was going. She had flour on her sleeve, her hair was coming loose on the left side. She hadn't changed, not really. Or she'd changed completely. He couldn't always tell the difference anymore, which seemed right. She reached him and handed him a cup and looked out at the creek. Fence needs work, she said. He looked. She was right. 2 of the south posts had developed a lean from the wet summer, the ground having shifted under them. Another season, and they'd be a problem. I'll fix it this week, he said. She nodded. She sipped her coffee. Ruth appeared at their side from nowhere, grabbed Evelyn's free hand, and then, for reasons known only to herself, let go and ran back toward the barn. She's going to hurt herself doing that, Evelyn said. Probably, he agreed. We should put something softer near the barn door. She'll just hurt herself somewhere else. Evelyn glanced at him sideways. That's not very reassuring. It's accurate, though. She made a sound that was reluctant agreement, and they watched Ruth change direction mid-run for no apparent reason and head toward the garden instead. The mountains were going gold in the early autumn light. The creek moved over its stones the way it always had. The land sat around them in the specific quiet of a September afternoon in northern Colorado. Not silent, not still, just settled into itself. Wyatt held his coffee and looked at his fence and thought about the man who had stood in this same spot 7 years ago with a post in his hand and his life arranged around the careful architecture of not wanting too much. He thought about what that man had believed. That small was safe. That keeping everything manageable meant keeping everything intact. That the fear of losing something was a reasonable argument for never fully having it. He had been wrong about all of it. Not just a little wrong. Foundationally, structurally wrong in a way that had cost him years he couldn't get back. He didn't waste time regretting those years. What was the point? They had happened. They had made him the particular person who had eventually, slowly, finally understood what was standing right in front of him. But he thought sometimes about the people who were still living the way he had lived, who had built their lives small on purpose, calling it wisdom, who had decided that wanting something was a vulnerability they couldn't afford. He thought about them the way you think about a version of yourself you can clearly see from the outside now, with the specific sorrow of someone who knows that understanding can't be transferred, only arrived at. All you could do was arrive at it, and try not to wait so long. Evelyn said, "What are you thinking about?" He looked at her. "The fence," he said. She looked at him with the expression she had that meant she knew the answer was true and incomplete simultaneously. "What else?" He watched Ruth in the garden, crouching over something in the dirt with the total absorption of someone who has found the most interesting thing in the world and is taking it completely seriously. "Nothing much," he said. "Everything." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then she leaned slightly, her shoulder against his arm, easy and unceremonious, the way people touch when touch has become a language they don't need to translate. "The fence can wait until Thursday," she said. "I need help with the feed store order tomorrow." "All right." "And Ruth wants you to show her how to properly stake the garden beds before the first freeze. She's 6. She wants to know anyway." He thought about this. "All right." Ruth stood up suddenly from whatever she'd been examining and ran toward them with something in her fist. A stone, it turned out, round and dark from the creek bed. "Papa," she said, holding it up with the seriousness of a declaration. "This one is the best." He crouched down and looked at it. It was a flat gray stone, unremarkable, the kind the creek produced by the thousand. "It is," he said, with complete sincerity. Ruth examined it once more, satisfied, and then tucked it into her pocket and ran back toward the barn. Evelyn was watching him. He stood back up and met her eyes, and she had the real smile, the one he'd watched from across a creek 7 years ago, without understanding what he was seeing. The unplanned one, the one that was only for this. He had built a ranch from a widow's abandoned property. He had survived a decade of winters and bad seasons and the particular loneliness of a life arranged to need nothing. And he had almost, through stubbornness and fear and a fundamental misunderstanding of what safety actually meant, missed this. The fence needed work. The feed store order needed doing. Ruth would be back in approximately 40 seconds with either another stone or a question about something he wouldn't be able to anticipate. The mountains were gold. The creek moved on. And Wyatt Mercer, who had once been a man who'd forgotten how to want more, stood on the south edge of his land in the September light with coffee going cold in his hand and his daughter's voice carrying across the yard